Welcome to the 10th Annual Pentagon Observance of Public Service Recognition Week. This is your ceremony designed to let you know what a great job you do and how much the leadership appreciates your efforts. Please remain standing for presentation of colors and the singing of our national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Please be seated. I want to thank Mike Ryan, Marine Corps Band, and the Joint Color Guard for another great performance. We got and welcome our sign interpreter, language interpreter, Miss Aretha Green. And I'd like to open the program by reading you a letter. The letter goes, it's called Public Service Recognition Week. Each day in schools and offices across our country, in hospitals, parks, museums, and on military installations, America's public employees dedicate their time, energy, and talent to create a brighter future for their fellow citizens and for our nation. Defending our country, protecting its environment, educating our children, safeguarding our health, they carry out their myriad responsibilities with quiet determination and genuine commitment to excellence. Too often we take their contributions for granted, but their work has an enormous impact on the quality of our lives and the future of our country. During Public Service Recognition Week, we have the opportunity to recognize and honor those dedicated women and men from all walks of life who serve our country in local and state governments and at the federal level. In a time of leaner budgets and smaller staffs, they work hard to inspire and maintain the public's trust in government, to forge effective partnerships between private and public sectors, and to make government work better for all our people. Accepting greater responsibility and increased accountability, public employees continue to rise to new challenges, keeping America growing as we approach the dawn of the 21st century. As we observe this special week, I urge my fellow Americans to join me in paying tribute to all those who work so hard each day to improve the quality of our lives and to keep our nation strong and free. I encourage young people especially to learn about careers in public service and to recognize that there are few professions more important or fulfilling. On behalf of a grateful nation, I salute America's public employees and extend best wishes for a memorable observance. That letter is signed by one Bill Clinton, our president. As the president observed, our public servants come in many forms. We have military members, career civilians, special government employees, and employees whose job it is to promote the policies of the administration in power. They're all public servants, and it's an honor to be associated with them. The department's leadership agrees and is here to help pay tribute to the men and women of the Department of Defense. Let me introduce our platform guests to you. On my immediate right, the Director for Logistics of the Joint Staff, General John Cusick. The Undersecretary of the Army, Joe Reeder. Secretary of the Air Force, Sheila Widnall. And the Secretary of the Navy, John Dalton. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Secretary Cohen, who was sworn in as the 20th Secretary of Defense on January 24th. He was approved unanimously by the Senate. He had served 3 terms in the House and 3 terms in the Senate. He has a bachelor's degree in Latin from Bowdoin and a Bachelor of Laws degree cum laude from Boston University. He's authored or co-authored 8 books, including 2 books of poetry, 3 novels, 3 works of nonfiction. And he moves freely from the world of fiction to the world of nonfiction. I'm not sure how he characterizes the world of the Pentagon, but I am certain he is comfortable with ambivalence. As a matter of fact, he brings to mind a quote by baseball manager Tommy Lasorda, who said, "Managing is like holding a dove in your hand. Squeeze it too hard and you kill it. Not hard enough and it flies away." Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Secretary of Defense, Secretary Cohen.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, Doc, thank you very much for that clever introduction. You can tell that the tobacco wars are really heating up as you take a look at Doc's face. He has announced he'd rather fight than switch, and only I think it might have been with Mrs. Cooke. And looks like she won.
She always does.
Well, Doc, thank you very much for that generous introduction. It reminded me of that portion of that song that he's a walking contradiction, partly truth and partly fiction. With respect to the Pentagon, I think you'd have to say it's a work in progress between whether or not it's fact or fiction. But I want to thank you not only for the introduction, but also for your generous public service in support of this department. I've come to realize in a very short period of time the secret of Doc's success. He makes it seem as if the Secretary of Defense is in charge of the Pentagon. But you all know, and I realize, that secretaries come and go, but the Doc is the rock in DOD. And he's seen a lot of change over the years, and I think he's going to see even more change in the near future. And I'm not talking about the renovations that take place from time to time. I'd like to find some way to stop that drilling right under my office, but I guess that's not simply in the cards for me, and not during the next 4 years at least. It may take 20 years before they finally finish the drilling, and then I'm sure they'll start on another portion of the building. But I'm talking about a revolution, about making dramatic changes in the way we operate as an organization. And we want you to be revolutionaries. And revolutions usually begin with people asking impudent questions that challenge the older order of things. And that's precisely what we're doing right now with the so-called Quadrennial Defense Review. It's much like the base review in 1991, the so-called bottom-up review of 1993. The QDR is asking some fundamental questions about America's defense for the new era. We're asking, for example, what kind of armed forces do we need for the next century? What do we want our forces to do, and how do we want them to carry out those duties? What programs and policies and technologies do we need, and how are we going to pay for it? And these are tough questions, and I want you to know how much I appreciate the work that all of you are contributing to try to come up with the answers to these questions. And I know it's taking time out of your busy day, which is already too busy, in order to try to develop some of the material that we can make these tough decisions on. It's sort of like trying to overhaul your engine while you're driving down the highway, but somehow you seem to be doing it and doing it well. And I must tell you, it's been something of an education for me coming to the Pentagon, because when I was in the Senate, I used to rely upon a small professional staff whom I'd known collectively for decades. And now I have hundreds and literally thousands of people who are supporting me, and that's both a blessing and also a challenge, I must tell you. It's a blessing to be surrounded by so many truly dedicated and talented people, and it's a challenge for me to know how to use your talents wisely. And I would say to you, it's very easy for me to stand up here and give you praise in front of you. I also want you to know, however, I'm talking behind your back. For instance, just a couple of weeks ago, I was down in Miami, Florida, speaking to the Western Hemisphere Security Symposium. And the audience there included military and civilian defense leaders from all over Latin America, many from the new democracies that have emerged in that region. And our strategy is to help these nations become strong, secure democracies, which ultimately will protect that regional stability. And so we're encouraging these nations to bring their armed forces under professional civilian leadership and to create a system very much like our own here in the United States. In my speech, I talked to them about the QDR process to illustrate how our system works in practice. And I told them about my very knowledgeable cadre of advisors and staff, and both military and civilian, who are working together on the QDR as a team. And I told them how teamwork really makes the final product both politically and militarily more realistic, and it makes for a much stronger policy in defense and the wise use of military power. And I said to them, as I say to you right now, as Secretary of Defense, I am proud of our civilian and military team. And I can't emphasize that enough. When I was on Capitol Hill, I used to, whenever groups came to me, they would thank me for everything I had done. And I would accept the praise and yet try to share it. Because the fact of the matter is that I didn't deserve most of the praise. I always had the best and the brightest people I could possibly find to work for me. And I always tried to find people who are actually smarter than I am, and I was. And I figured if I hired them as smart as they were, they would make me look that much more capable. And you know, it worked. It paid off. I got a lot of compliments and a lot of public approval. But the fact of the matter was I was standing on their shoulders. And I used to use the football metaphor of being a Walter Payton or a Jim Brown or you name the fullback, who's always cutting through the line and running for glory, who always got the accolades. But of course, none of them could have succeeded without having the hogs down the front line, on the Redskins as they're called, and having their noses in the turf and really digging and making those wide holes so they could run through. And that's the way I always treated my staff as the real heroes of my operation, and why I didn't feel I deserved the kind of accolades I was getting. I always went to the floor fully prepared. I had the best briefs that one could ask for. I had the best, most insightful and politically astute counsel I could possibly have, and it allowed me to perform better. And that's precisely the way I look at the public servants, those of you who are serving here in the Pentagon. Not only our military, which I have said time and time again, are the best and brightest, the most capable military force of anywhere in the world today and at all times, but also the civilian personnel who support them, because they couldn't carry out their functions as tough and arduous as they are without your help as well. So it really is a team effort. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be issuing the QDR report to Congress, and then we're going to go to Congress to try to implement those decisions. And one of my chief measures, I should say, of success for the QDR is it's a bit broader. Is to try and provoke an open, lively, hopefully an honest and helpful debate about the national discussion on our defense strategy and requirements and resources. We have to have a bipartisan discussion that's inclusive, not only of the policymakers in this administration and Congress, but also the American people. And so the QDR is clearly going to outline the choices for our country and the risk involved in each of these choices. And I can't tell you, George Wilson's in the audience right now, so I can't tell you what I'm going to recommend to the QDR. He'll have it out tomorrow in that early bird. But I can tell you about some of the ideas that the QDR has rejected. For example, someone had proposed that the Air Force hold bake sales to pay for the F-22s. That one came from the Army, I think. We also dropped the idea that we ask Bob Dole for a big loan. And someone had the temerity to suggest that we cut the Secretary of Defense's speeches in half so people can get back to work. I personally squashed that one. But I did want to take just a few moments of your time today to talk about something else we rejected in the QDR, and that is business as usual in the Department of Defense. We have to change, and we're going to change the way in which we operate. By the turn of the century, the department will not be the same organization as today, but that change has to begin today. In fact, it's already begun. And to understand how we have to change it, I think we have to consider what happened to corporate America in the past 10 years. For decades, if you think about it, America was on top of the world in virtually every category. I could point to the automobile manufacturers as a classic example. I mean, when I was growing up, every automobile on our highways was made in America. It was a Cadillac, an Oldsmobile, maybe even a DeSoto, a Nash Rambler. You name the car, but it was made here. And then something happened. Something happened between the 40s, the 50s, and 60s. In the early 70s, we found that those cars traveling on our highways were quite different. They were Hondas and Toyotas and Mazdas and other types of automobiles made not in America, but principally in Japan. And now they're from Korea and other countries. And what corporate America found out, they took a look at themselves and they said, we've gotten soft, we've gotten flabby, we've gotten too much structure here, we've got to get lean, we've got to restructure our organization. And it was a very painful experience for them to go through. But they engaged in downsizing and right-sizing and outsourcing and all of the code words that we use now to look back on what they were able to achieve. But they went through this painful process of shedding a lot of excess weight that they were carrying so they couldn't be competitive in the international environment. And now, as a result of that exercise regime they went through, they're back on top. And now we're looking to see what did they do? How did they accomplish that? Obviously, there are a lot of painful decisions involved in how they were able to achieve that downsizing and right-sizing and outsourcing. And we want to learn from them how we can apply some of that, at least, to the Department of Defense. We started it in several categories. I'm looking now at Dr. Paul Kaminsky, whom I've praised on a number of occasions from this spot, as a matter of fact. I think I've mixed up so many references to him between Galahad and I'm not sure who else I've called you in the past. But he and Secretary Perry started a revolution in our acquisition affairs. We were loaded down with an obsolete and totally out-of-date system of acquiring our technology. And that's something that's very much involved in this entire QDR process. We need to find ways to shift money from our budget of operations and support into the acquisition of new systems. And thanks to Dr. Kaminsky and others, we've been able to achieve some revolution in our acquisition policies. But it doesn't stop with acquisition. It really has to go into operations as well. It has to be applied here, right in the Office of Secretary of Defense, our defense-wide agencies. We've got to find ways in which we can do things better and cheaper and faster. Last evening, I inflicted a speech upon Secretary Widnall and Joe Reeder and others at a dinner. I'll try not to inflict a speech that's too much longer here. But we really do have to find ways in which we can shed systems that we've had around for too long as far as the paperwork is concerned in this building. I used to, when I was up in the Senate, talk a lot about the travel regulations. There were some, I guess, hundreds of pages of regulations pertaining to travel, and some 1,300, as I recall, 1,300 pages pertaining to travel reimbursement regulations. And most in the private sector have about 13. And that's where we have to get in terms of saving real money. We could save approximately $1 billion a year just in that particular facet of our operations alone. We purchase a lot of goods and services during the course of a year. About 75% of those purchases are under $2,500. And yet we're not using the credit card enough in which to acquire those services. There was a report last year where a daycare center in Europe ordered roughly $1,200 worth of candies and other types of surprises and decorations for a party. And yet they didn't use a credit card. They, in fact, filled out a contract, I think it was 11 pages long, with some 26 separate lines of accounting lines, which ended up costing almost $1,200 in terms of the accounting audit. So we spent as much to acquire the product, to review it, as we did to acquire it. You could have had it for about 2% had we used a credit card. So there are things that we have to do in the very near future if we're going to have any hope of saving the kind of money that we need to save and operating in the kind of fashion that we need to operate if we're going to make this QDR process a real success. And so what I really want to talk to you about is how we can join in this effort together to come up with your participation in finding ways that we can be more creative, how we can streamline and reduce duplication and redundancy in our day-to-day operations. Because the fact of the matter is that we're going through a QDR process, and I've said it's strategy-driven, and it is strategy-driven. I've also said we have to do it in a constrained budgetary environment, and that means we've got people up on Capitol Hill said this is all you're going to get. And it's all we're going to get for the foreseeable future. We're looking at budgets roughly in the neighborhood of $250 billion for the foreseeable future. That may sound like a lot of money to some people, but the fact is that in 1985, we'd be spending roughly $400 billion in today's, if you count today's dollars. So we're down from around $400 billion to $250. We've also cut our force structure by a third. We have cut our procurement by 67%. And so we've made a number of very substantial reductions over the past decade. Most people still assume that we're simply the old Cold War warriors. That isn't the case, but that's the public perception out there. And so we're now going through the process of trying to identify how we, in fact, are going to slim down, how we're going to modernize, how we're going to keep our military the best and the brightest and the most capable to face the entire spectrum of threats that we're likely to face in the foreseeable future. And we're going to call upon each of you to examine ways in which we can do things better and smarter and less expensive. Now, I think I ought to stop here and tell you that once again, how much I appreciate what you have done in the past. And I never fully appreciated it. I talked about this a little bit last night at the dinner table. Someone said, what has surprised you the most about your job? Well, there are a number of things that have surprised me. Cooke, for one. He fills me with surprises virtually every day he comes into my office. But it may sound strange, but I think those of us who were sitting in the Senate, we became great generalists. And you know what a generalist is. That's someone who knows less and less about more and more until he knows absolutely nothing about everything. And that's sort of the way in which the Senate operated, because we had to skim along the surface of so many different committees. I was serving on 4 committees at one time, 5 committees, and about 14 different subcommittees, all of which met at the same time. And Fred Pang knows how the Senate used to operate, still does. And so we would come into a committee room, and a staffer would be there saying, here's a witness, why don't you ask the following types of questions. And I usually, when it came to armed services at least, tried to stay for the entire meeting. I wanted to examine the witnesses for myself and listen to all the testimony so I could at least sharpen my questions to see if I couldn't be a little tougher on the witness if I could. But for the most part, we're skimming along the surface. And for the most part, I think very few on Capitol Hill would appreciate the scope of things that you have to encounter. Very few would appreciate the total dedication that I see day in and day out of everybody who comes to work in this building. And when I leave the building and go out and visit the troops in the field, I am enormously impressed. I can't tell you the sense of pride that I feel when I walk out, get out of that big car, with a heavy doors you can barely open, and run up those stairs. And I run up every morning because that's how enthusiastic I am when I come to work. And it's because I am surrounded by enthusiastic people. You know, sometimes you find walking into an office, you can have an air, an atmosphere about that office. You say, people aren't really excited to be here. When I walk into the Pentagon, I find people who have been up for a couple of hours already, out running, usually 5 or 6 or 7 miles, trying to get their exercise in before the sun really fully comes up, who are eager to do their work, who are can-do people, and who are totally dedicated to making this country the best in the world. I can't help but be impressed by that. I can't tell you how enthusiastic it makes me feel, and why I can then dedicate some 12 to 14 and sometimes 18 hours a day in the public service as well. I have spent most of my life in public service, most of my adult life, I should say. For the past 30 years, I started out at the age of 26, committed to public service. And it's something that I was actually almost out the door and going into the private sector, and received that phone call and asked if I wouldn't serve another 4 years. And when I found out that what would be involved, I said absolutely yes. Another 4 years is minor compared to the responsibilities the job carries and the good that we can do for the rest of the country and for the world itself. So I'm here today to celebrate your service to your country, to ask you to, again, think of ways in which we can become even better, that ways in which we can become more efficient, so that we don't have 1,300 pages of regulations, so that we don't have 14 pages of regulations describing a chocolate chip cookie for people to compete, to sell to the Pentagon, for not having offices which are long overdue in terms of their abolition, but basically saying, how do we get better in the years in which we're going to have fewer dollars in which to operate? So if you carry that spirit with you, I'm sure that we can conquer the challenges that we are faced with. And I will continue to stand up here each and every day and say how proud I am to be representing you as Secretary of Defense. Thank you.
I want to remind you that starting on Thursday, the 8th of May, there will be displays by over 60 government agencies. Of course, all of the Pentagon, the services, many of the defense agencies, and activities on the mall. You know, Public Service Recognition Week is now, we started out with 5 agencies on a rainy day some 10, 11 years ago. It's now being celebrated by over 2,000 installations and activities, not only in the United States, but military installations overseas. But the highlight here in Washington is the displays, the agencies, government departments, and so forth in the mall. If you get a chance, go down and see them. You'll learn, the people will welcome you. And this concludes our ceremony today. I want to thank you all for coming. As you go out, ponder in the words that we just heard this afternoon. Thank you.